Hello everyone and good evening. My name's Don Arleth and welcome to our main edition of World News Tonight here on TVP World. It's the third day of the UN General Assembly and all eyes are on the Ukrainian president and his mission to shore up support to win the war with Russia. There have been some successes and failures on this front. Washington has pledged another $7.9 billion in military assistance for Kyiv. But at the same time, the U.S. still refuses to allow Ukraine to strike targets deeper in Russia, where the attacks against Ukraine originate. We'll have more on that in just a minute, but first up, let's take a look at tonight's headlines. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer aims to reset relations with the EU at next week's meeting with Ursula von der Leyen. The Polish Parliament is working on a special bill to aid flood victims. And the latest edition of the Polish Film Festival in Gdynia features some of this year's finest film productions. And we start off tonight in Washington, where just moments ago, U.S. President Joe Biden met with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy at the White House. Their official meeting is part of Zelenskyy's trip to the United States, during which he also spoke at the UN General Assembly. The Ukrainian president is likely to thank Joe Biden for the newest aid package to Ukraine worth almost $8 billion. Zelenskyy is also expected to present his victory plan to Biden. Washington's support for Ukraine remains steadfast as U.S. President Joe Biden has pledged $7.9 billion worth of military aid to Kyiv, a day after pledging $375 million for the same cause. The latest round of assistance comes as Moscow again increases its nuclear threats, part of the Kremlin's effort to promote Western self-deterrence.
During his visit to the U.S., Volodymyr Zelenskyy managed to secure another $8 billion of aid for his armies. $7.9 billion of the total sum is part of a larger package approved by Congress in April this year. All of that money will be spent on additional ammunition, weapons, and most importantly, air defense systems and munitions crucial to ensuring Ukrainian skies remain Russia-free. Volodymyr Zelenskyy's trip to the U.S. also has another objective, pitching his victory plan to President Joe Biden, a plan to end the war in Ukraine without a full capitulation to Moscow.
It's important for us that all these people can understand us, understand that Ukraine wants to end this war more than anyone in the world.
While Zelenskyy's visit seems like a success on the surface, its consequences might not be visible until a new leader moves into the White House. Republican presidential candidate Donald Trump has refused to meet with the Ukrainian president this week. Republicans in America have also been criticizing Zelenskyy for visiting an ammunition factory in Scranton, Pennsylvania, alongside a host of Democrats.
The facility was in a politically contested battleground state, was led by a top political surrogate for Kamala Harris, and failed to include a single Republican because, on purpose, no Republicans were invited. The tour was clearly a partisan campaign event designed to help Democrats and is clearly election interference.
Many in Kyiv wonder if Washington's support for Ukraine will remain as staunch if Donald Trump wins the election in November. The former president suggested that if he was elected, he was very likely to cut aid to Ukraine to end the war.
Whether this will then actually end the war is another question, but he apparently does not want to exert more pressure on Russia. But instead on the victim, on Ukraine, and make basically Ukraine capitulate.
With fears of U.S. aid to Ukraine running dry being more real than ever, Moscow has decided to take advantage of the situation. Vladimir Putin recently said that Russia would consider an attack made by a non-nuclear state, Ukraine, supported by a state with nuclear capabilities, the U.S., as a joint attack.
Putin has talked a lot about some doomsday scenario, some apocalyptic answer that he would give, and about nuclear war, and also other representatives of the Russian regime or propagandists of the Russian regime have made many such statements. So I don't think that particular statement will have that much of an effect.
Thank you, sir.
With Russia's nuclear threats ramping up, Volodymyr Zelenskyy might encounter difficulties in securing one more crucial declaration while he's still in the U.S. The permission to use Washington's long-range weaponry on targets inside Russia.
And this just in, the Polish Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski has cut his visit to the United States short. The head of the Polish diplomacy has decided to return to Poland to take part in an emergency meeting of the Polish cabinet concerning changing the state budget to allocate more help and funds to help the victims of the floods. Poland and NATO allies work together on many levels, and one such platform for military cooperation is the multinational Corps Northeast, headquartered in Poland. Our reporter Marek Steele attended the ceremony marking the 25th anniversary of the Corps' foundation. Here are the details.
Szczecin in northwestern Poland is where the multinational Corps Northeast, which is part of NATO, is headquartered, and joined here with me today to speak about cooperation between, well, Polish, Danish, German and allied forces is Lieutenant Colonel Eric Gusenberger, Chief of Public Affairs of the multinational Corps Northeast. Hello and welcome.
Hello.
So please tell me, how does this multinational cooperation look like? You've been here for quite a while now, as far as I know. You've observed this cooperation throughout the years. What you can tell me about it?
Yeah, we are a huge team of 21 nations, all NATO nations, and that means that we have to work on a common understanding. So our main language is English, and this is our working language. And of course, you can see and you can learn a lot from different nations, especially if I look at my team, for example. I have a multinational team, I have a Polish deputy, I have Danish colleagues working with me, I have additional German ones. So it all comes together, and that is quite interesting and, yeah, and also sometimes challenging, but it's worth to do.
And this is the only such corps in this part of Europe, am I correct?
This is the only corps at the northeastern flank, that's right. But of course we have subordinate units in all the nations. In Poland we have a division additional, in Lithuania we have units, and in Estonia and in Latvia as well.
So what are the daily tasks of the Corps that you, Poles, Germans, Danes and all the other allied forces do on a day-to-day basis?
We are responsible for NATO's northeastern flank. That includes the border to Russia, from Estonia, over Latvia, Lithuania and Poland. And this is our area of responsibility. That makes us unique, because this is something which is also unique in NATO, that NATO Corps has a specific assigned region to be responsible of.
And what about cooperation between Germany and Lithuania? Because we know that Lithuania wants to join this multinational group as a framework country. We know that Germany is establishing a permanent base in Lithuania. What does that say about German-Lithuanian relations? What you can tell me from a military perspective, perhaps?
Since 2017, we have a very close cooperation to Lithuania, because Germany is responsible for, it was the Enhanced Forward Battle Group, so they stationed permanently a battalion, armored battalion in Lithuania on a rotational basis. And out of that, now it is like that Germany is more engaged and will in the near future also have a permanent brigade stationed in Lithuania, and that shows and it indicates how close the cooperation between Germany and Lithuania is. But it's also a NATO assigned, so we as NATO Corps in Szczecin will be responsible for that unit as well.
Thank you very much, Lieutenant Colonel. Thanks for joining us.
You're welcome.
And this was Lieutenant Colonel Eric Gusenberger, Chief Public Affairs of the Multinational Corps Northeast, stationed here in Szczecin.
European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has agreed to formal talks with British Prime Minister Keir Starmer. The meeting is set to take place next week and could signal a new chapter in UK-EU relations. Our correspondent in London, Claudia Trzewinska, has more in her report.
After an initial hiccup caused by misunderstandings over the UK government's caution over reinstating the Erasmus University Exchange and Youth Mobility programs, the plans for British Prime Minister Keir Starmer and European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen to meet are back on track. Keir Starmer is to travel to Brussels next week to attend a meeting which was supposed to take place earlier in September. The plans were made after the two leaders briefly met during the UN General Assembly in New York City this week. EU Commission's president also expressed her willingness to discuss the future of the relationship between the UK and the EU. This comes after a recent letter issued by German Interior Minister Nancy Faeser and her former French counterpart Gérald Darmanin, who urged EU officials to present a draft negotiation mandate that would strengthen cooperation between both sides.
The arrival in office of a new British government demonstrating its intention to cooperate constructively with the EU seems to us to be conducive to concrete progress on this issue.
The meeting is a positive development between two sides that have drifted apart after Brexit. The UK is not yet out of deep waters, as cooperation in a variety of fields will depend on the EU and the UK's willingness to compromise. From London for TVP World, I'm Klaudia Czerwińska.
How to keep Europe competitive. This is what Europe's industry ministers clashed over on Thursday. Center stage, Mario Draghi's competitiveness report and a debate on state aid and support for small and medium enterprises. Now we go to our correspondent Sasha Farbach, who's in Brussels.
How to keep Europe competitive. That was the main point here today against the likes of China and the United States. In that landmark Draghi report, and also from a few months ago the Leyen report, it was the first time that European ministers of industry were able to digest this, but it was very clear from the arrivals here in the morning that there was a difference of expectation and a difference of how to get that done.
We don't completely agree on the offered solutions and recommendations, and our position is that we have to keep in mind our individual member state strengths, economic strengths. And there is no solution that one size will fit everyone.
I think we have to create bigger European industrial groups.
So already a very different policy. Spain departing from a very different type of policy in terms of mergers, calling for bigger European champions, and also the Latvians and the Nordics looking very much at not quite sure on how to fund all this. There's also dismay by the Polish minister by the sheer fact that Central and Eastern Europe was not consulted in full in the Draghi report itself.
The economy of Central and Eastern Europe has been growing steadily, especially the Polish economy. So there is something that we can share. I mean, we have a very good experience with economic growth, and we have a very good experience with cohesion policy. So I think Draghi would benefit from hearing that story.
The minister did go on to say that there are positive elements, calling the Draghi report a milestone, which could be a good stepping stone for more discussion. But as the press conference closed, it was very clear from the Hungarian minister chairing this council that this was not clear on how to do this the best way forward. Yes, there was talk about deregulation. Yes, there was talk about removing administrative burdens. But on the subject of financing, he was very elusive, saying that is a sensitive topic when I pressed him on that subject, clearly showing that much more work is ahead until Europe is competitive. And Draghi's advice about not wasting any time was perhaps not listened to here today. This is Sasha Farbach for TVP World in Brussels.
The main flood wave, or surge, in Poland is moving further north towards the Baltic Sea. While the natural disaster is not over yet, the majority of the country is now focused on cleanup operations. Meanwhile, the Polish parliament held the first reading of a special bill today on providing aid to the victims of the floods.
The flood wave has reached the Polish seaside provinces, but the worst is already behind us. The government is preparing billions of euro of aid for the victims of the flood. Many of them lost their entire livelihoods in the water. The Polish parliament held the first reading of the special bill on dealing with the consequences of the flood on Thursday. Members of the ruling coalition hope to get it adopted as soon as possible.
We would like the bill to be adopted by the entire parliament. The good of the victims is our top priority. It would be a shame if political infighting got in the way of that goal.
The main opposition party, Conservative Law and Justice, believes the government will not be allocating enough relief funds to help the victims. While the ruling coalition can pass the bill without the opposition's votes, the right-wing MPs still hope for a constructive dialogue.
I wouldn't say that they are bad, but I would say that they are not enough. And it can be heard in the discussion because the opposition members of parliament are putting forward proposals that could be implemented to improve the whole package. And we hope that the government will be working hand in hand with us, because this is not a political issue.
If the parliament fails to adopt this bill on October 1st, this Tuesday, the next parliamentary session will take place on October 9th. And for many of the victims of the flood, this would be rather late. So we have to wait and see whether the parliament manages to agree on that bill after the weekend. From Warsaw, TVP World, Kazimierz Łysiak.
The Polish government has proposed an amendment that would reduce the minimum distance at which wind turbines can be built from homes. If passed, the law could lead to a fourfold production increase in onshore wind farms by the end of the next decade.
200 meters may not seem a lot, but for the development of onshore wind farms, it's a crucial difference.
Having 500 meters instead of 700 meters is going to be a game changer for the wind industry. And this is something that not only the wind industry, but also in general, the Polish economy needs.
According to the draft bill published by the Polish Ministry of Climate and Environment, this change increases the potential area for wind energy development by 44%. With a significant boost to energy generation output expected. Poland's onshore wind farms currently have a capacity of 9.5 gigawatts. The new bill is expected to double this number by the end of the decade, and then again by 2040. The updated legislation will also accelerate the permit approval process by 1/3, reducing the timeline to around 4 years. However, while this major barrier for industry development has now been addressed, Tobiasz Adamczewski stressed that other issues still remain.
The onshore wind will need capacity in order to connect to the grid, and the grid development is going to be one of the major issues in the upcoming years, not only for wind, but also for photovoltaics.
Total investment by all companies, including the private sector in grid modernization, is projected to reach around 32 billion euros in the coming years. Without it, fully capitalizing on renewable energy production will not be possible.
And now on a lighter note for lovers of cinema, it's that time of year again. In Gdynia, films are competing for the Golden Lions Awards. And just like every year, the Polish Film Festival has attracted all the best new pictures. So let's take a look.
Under the volcano, Poland's bid for the upcoming Oscars kicked off this year's festival.
It's a history about a Ukrainian family that was on holiday when the war started, and it's about the journey going back home to the home country.
The film, along with 15 others, is competing for the main prize of the festival, the Golden Lions.
The lions come from the fact that the festival started many years ago in Gdańsk, and the classic Golden Gdańsk Lions were an inspiration.
Now in Gdynia, lions come in a variety of colors. One of them is platinum, for lifetime achievement. Andrzej Wajda and Roman Polański, among others, were presented with this award. This year, Platinum Lions will go to Wojciech Marczewski.
It is an award that gives great satisfaction. It is like a pass to a certain club of people who had a say about the shape of our culture.
The festival also awards films in other categories, including Best Short Film and Perspective.
All of the films in the Perspective contest are debuts of each director.
The winners of each category will be known on Saturday. Given that its first edition took place in 1974, the Polish Film Festival in Gdynia is one of the oldest in Europe.
By traveling to the United Nations General Assembly in New York, one of the Ukrainian president's main goals was to gain support for his 4-point victory plan. According to unconfirmed reports, Western leaders were unimpressed by Zelenskyy's plan. However, it wasn't for nothing. The United States doled out another $8 billion in military assistance, which will prove essential for Kyiv to continue its fight until the end of the year. On the other front, Vladimir Putin is doubling down on his war of choice. Earlier, Russia said it would not sit down for any peace talks, saying that Russia will fight until it achieves its goals. Moscow has also picked up its nuclear saber rattling intended to promote Western self-deterrence. And now joining me to discuss is Adrian Karatnitsky, senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and author of this new book, Battleground Ukraine. We'll see if we can take a look at that. Adrian, thank you very much for joining me today. We appreciate it. Speaking of President Zelenskyy's trip to New York, his main goal, as I mentioned, was probably to shore up support for his 4-point peace plan, which we know some of the details of which. However, leaders were unimpressed by this, saying that this is more calls for lifting of the restrictions on the use of Western weapons on Russian targets inside Russia. And just more of the same as far as the Ukrainian point of view goes. Yet we do see another military aid package to the tune of $7.9 billion. So with these two things standing aside, do you think that President Zelenskyy's trip to New York was worth it?
Well, it has to be worth it because this is an ongoing dialogue. We've seen historically Ukraine ask for different kinds of assistance and different kinds of weapons. There has always been a lag time, and Ukraine keeps pressing, and that policy is important. There are many people in the US Congress, oddly enough, many even in the Republican Party, that support a more aggressive posture towards Russia and believe that this doctrine of managing escalation with Russia is incorrect. I do think that the discourse in the opinion elite is changing. Many, many more voices of policy experts are saying that Ukraine must be in a position to inflict the same kind of pain, or at least to threaten reciprocity for what Russia is doing, for example, to Ukraine's energy system. The storm shadows that Britain has conferred to Ukraine, and storm shadows in general, have a range that would reach the entire non-nuclear power system that feeds the Moscow region, which is the center or the hub of the military operation. It produces SS-300s, SS-400s, and Buk missiles, so there is ample international law argument to consider that a legitimate military target. 25% of Russia's GDP is dependent on Moscow. Crippling Moscow and creating the kind of disruptions that Kyiv faces, or at least having the ability to reciprocate if Russia again attacks Ukraine's power grid, is the next step, I believe. And again, these are always very difficult discussions, but I believe that they will eventually achieve their aim. I think there will be a change of administration, and if it is, say, Kamala Harris, there is a possibility that she will look to avoid an endless war. Because at the moment, this is a war of inches rather than of rapid movement. Even all this movement that Russia has made in Ukraine, made in the Kursk region, this is minuscule compared, it's been calculated that at this pace, Russia will need 300 years to reconquer the rest of Ukraine, and Ukraine would probably need several thousand years based on the Kursk operation to capture, say, European Russia. So realistically, the question is, do we want an endless war, a war of attrition which Ukraine inevitably will lose because it has fewer bodies to throw into the effort than Russia? Really, we need to find a way to change the calculus. And that's what President Zelenskyy is trying to do. These are new ideas, they're radical ideas, they're uncomfortable ideas for many policymakers, but once they are advocated, we've seen with all sorts of other issues. We remember the Obama administration wouldn't even provide anti-tank weapons to Ukraine. It took Trump to be the first one to do it. Then when the war was ready to begin, the US was very reluctant to provide anything more than arms for a guerrilla movement thinking Ukraine would lose. Ukraine has always outperformed. Ukraine has always outmaneuvered Russia, but now there is this gap of resources. And I think that hitting Russian targets that disrupt the economy and the war machine is the next step to driving Putin to the negotiating table. There's no inclination to do so.
$7.9 billion in new aid announced to provide Ukraine with joint standoff weapon, long-range munitions, or JSOWs, and also an additional Patriot battery and ammunition for the Patriot systems. Is this going to help Ukraine achieve anything, or
I think it's
rather
a recipe
help them stay in the fight?
It's a recipe for stasis, but stasis is important because it gives more time to make these kinds of more fundamental arguments about how the war should be prosecuted and what it will take to bring Putin to the negotiating table. I think there are some heads of government, heads of state that support the Ukrainian position. I think their influence will continue to grow. And I think eventually the West has to confront how long should this go on? How many more tens of thousands of civilian Ukrainian lives should be shed, not to speak of the many tens of thousands of military? And should this go on from year after year after year with no sign of a let-up?
So President Zelenskyy visits a munitions factory in Pennsylvania with many Democratic politicians in tow, facing huge backlash from Republicans, from the House, I believe it's House Speaker, as well as the cancellation of his meeting with Donald Trump.
Not quite, because Trump never announced that there would be a meeting. Mm-hmm. I think he ignored President Duda's request for a meeting, and he also ignored President Zelensky's. Maybe retroactively they're saying this is in reaction to this, but in fact there was never an affirmative confirmation of a meeting between Zelenskyy and Trump. Trump issued a vicious statement full of lies in which he claimed that Ukraine had basically lost the war and that he would be cynically saving Ukrainian lives by forcing a settlement, which means capitulation. I think this has raised the stakes for Ukraine in this war. And then after that attack, the Speaker of the House unfortunately chose to emphasize what I think was a mistake, but could charitably be forgiven and could be balanced by an event such as a meeting with Trump that shows that he is open to dialogue with the entire leadership. But I think that the message is out. Trump is out to push Ukraine into Russia's sphere of influence, and he could care less about Zelenskyy. There is an animus now that he is creating an image of Zelenskyy as this huckster who is taking hundreds of billions of dollars from U.S. taxpayers and prosecuting a war that's, instead of defending its people, is actually killing its people. It's complete demagogy, which is not shared by many Republicans and is not shared by many Republican voters, according to the polls, because there's still majority support for Ukraine.
So what extent do you think that Donald Trump is saying this to reach that base of the party? Is this a policy we can absolutely bank on if he becomes president? Or is this something that's subject to change?
Well, I think you have to look at trend lines. And until a few months ago, you could say that there were two competing schools of thought with people like Secretary Pompeo and Robert O'Neill, who were strong people in his inner circle, who were Trump whisperers speaking to him about sensible anti-Russian policies. But lately, with the appointment of Tulsi Gabbard as a key advisor, with Robert F. Kennedy, who basically wants the U.S. out of this war and let Russia and Ukraine solve it themselves, and of course J.D. Vance, who is one of the great neo-isolationists in American politics, all being empowered by Trump, it seems that there's a shift much more to I would say, a retreat from European obligations, and certainly to a retreat for any assistance to Ukraine.
Putin's new rules on potentially revising their nuclear doctrine, is this more saber-rattling, by the Russian president, or is this something? Also, is it meant to promote Western self-deterrence, with Putin saying that he will consider strikes using Western weapons, say, on Russian territory as a joint attack.
Well, this game has been going on for the entire period of the war. It's one of the reasons why there is such a lag time in providing Ukraine with adequate weaponry. Ukraine has been targeting even short-range Russian targets on the Russian side of the border, and not just in Russian-occupied Ukraine for for the last year, certainly. So this is just extending the range. I think, Ukrainians who have had this, the person who knows Putin best is President Xi of China, who's met him over 30 times and on whom Putin is somewhat dependent. And Ukrainian diplomats who've had serious engagement with the Chinese side have told me that they are convinced that the Chinese believe that Russia will not go there. That Russia will not use tactical nuclear weapons, and Russia will not use against Ukraine, not to speak of the NATO alliance. I think these are attempts to play at some of the fears that people have, and it also empowers Trump to be able to say, we got to forget about Ukraine because we're at risk of nuclear war. And he's playing Trump, I think, a bit with this kind of form of saber rattling. It's very targeted saber rattling.
Adrian Karadnitsky, senior fellow at the Atlantic Council and author of From Independence to the War with Russia, Battleground Ukraine. You can find it in your local bookstore somewhere near and soon. Thank you very much, sir, for joining us tonight. We very much appreciate it.